Right, tonight I've called my talk Aldbourne in the 17th Century, Lands, Lords and Litigation.
You want to come and listen?
And I think we're all aware that through time there have been many disputes on matters particularly to do with the Warren and the Chase over the 16th and 17th century. So we're aware of the dispute that led to the wonderful map that we have on display. I've talked before about problems that Queen Elizabeth had with stopping the nasty Goddards and Warrens from pinching her deer and stuff like this. But I've discovered that there's a completely new dispute that ran for about 60 odd years all the way through the 17th century. And so I'm going to look at the background causes and the progress of that particular dispute, but also touching on several others and looking at its final denouement, which actually changed things quite radically here in the village and around the village. And I'm also going to look at the lordship of the manor and also the main tenancies of the manor and the personalities that were involved in that. And I've been very surprised by some of the people that have turned up through looking into those. Now, a lot of my research over the last 6 months or so has been triggered off by something which I found in the Wiltshire Museum Library. I found it a good few years ago in a cupboard. There are a series of bound volumes marked Wiltshire Genealogy, really large volumes. And very early on, about 2016, I said, oh, I'd like to have a look at the one for Aldbourne, please. And a very sheepish librarian came back about 20 minutes later saying, we're terribly sorry, but we can't find the key to open the cupboard that it's in. And that's how it remained for several years until a couple of years ago, just before the lockdown. I asked once again, and they said, "Oh yes, we have new keys for all of the cupboards," and so they were able to open it. And what we found, I'm not sure what you're seeing there. Good. The first binder, the first volume, is Aldbourne to, I can't remember what it said. You may have seen it on the. So the first pages in it, and they're handwritten pages, they're handwritten notes, bound into these volumes, and the first almost 150, I think it's 147 pages of the first volume are all handwritten notes about Aldbourne, very closely written, and these are foolscap size pages, larger than, almost half as large again as A4. So there's a lot of stuff there. And what I've discovered is that this is research that was done by a man called John Sadler, sometime in the 1910s and early 1920s, because these are the notes which led to him publishing a paper in the WANS, the Wiltshire Archaeological and Historical and Natural History Society magazine, in December 1924, called Aldbourne, Manor, Chase and Warren, Wiltshire. And that was in the WANS in December 1924. And we have a reprint of it here in our own library. It's ALDHC 149, if you want to go and look for it in the case. In the Heritage Centre, yes, in the Heritage Centre. Sorry?
Click on the next.
Okay, sorry. So there we are, Aldbourne Manor, Chase and Warren. Sorry, I'm reading from the wrong copy of the screen here. One wonderful thing about this document, in contrast to many other histories of Aldbourne, this gentleman recorded the source of every piece of information that he wrote down. Unfortunately, between the Public Record Office in the 1910s and 20s and today's National Archives, the catalogue numbers have all been changed. And so it's not easy to map his references across to the modern reference. However, I'm sure that over time we will overcome that hurdle. Anyway, what do we know or thought we did about the manor? I'm going to look at the lands first. We know, here we are, here's our entry in Domesday. So we know it's been a royal manor since Domesday, and it eventually became part of the Duchy of Lancaster. We knew or believed that it had been handed to the City of London round about 1625 by Charles I as part repayment of his debts, and that it was originally based on a common land tenancy. But by the time we got to look at the 1809 census, 1809 Enclosure Act, and this was a display which we had in the centre back in 2017 and 2018, we found that a third of the manor had already been enclosed before the Enclosure Act came in to reassign all of the common land. So when had that happened, and why had that happened, and who done it? So that is going to be the first part of my talk. This is what we found when we looked at those enclosure maps. And we found that a large part of the western part of the parish had already been enclosed, including, there we are, we've got shown the area of Upham and Snap and Hayden. And lower down, we've got Stock Close. And also the Warren was enclosed. The Chase by 1809, that had seemingly been very large in 1607, looking at that map, the Chase had been reduced to a tiny rump. Whereas by comparison with that 1607 map, the original Chase looked something like that. So the Chase had been enclosed, and why? How had all this happened? Now, a clue came up in this man's notes. And here we are. Here are some of his notes, his folio 17. It says that there's an interesting deed printed in volume 3 of Wiltshire Notes and Queries, which is actually the edition for 1894. And if we look at Wiltshire Notes and Queries for 1894, it records that a gentleman called Reynold William Knightley Goddard of Denmark Hill, London, held this ancient lease by which some of the lands of Aldbourne had been leased to the Goddard family. And it goes on then in this magazine, there is a print of the contents of that document. I take it the Goddard family still hold it? Are you aware of anything like that? Not yours. No. And it's the lease and the reversion of Upham, Snap and Hayden, plus lands at Pratts and Rounce, which are two of the fields up there towards Upham, from Hugh Hawkins and Anthony
Yes, from the
Martin to
first house
Richard
on the left.
Goddard. And it's dated 1634. And it specifically accepts the Chase and Warren, as they are separate from any land which is being dealt in the manor of Aldbourne. And it quotes various older charters and indentures. An indenture that passed from 1617, whereby the duchy passed its lands to Prince Charles himself as a personal property. And then after the passing of the manor to the City of London in 1625, there has to be another document here, which is quoted from 1628, whereby Prince Charles then passed the lands that he had also to the City of London to complete the passage of all of the lands of the manor to the City of London. And then there's one of 1631, where the City of London pass the land to Hugh Hawkins and Anthony Martin. And it's fairly clear from the way that this is worded that Hugh Hawkins and Anthony Martin are just nominees of the city who've been given the job of finding a tenant for these lands, or being the instrument through which they pass the lands to the tenant. So 1634, we know those lands are already enclosed and they've been sold basically to the Goddard family. But we can go back 70 years before, and we come to the will of John Goddard in 1556. I'm just going to digress a little. 1556, if you're really sure of your historical dates, you might recognize that that's during the period when Queen Mary ruled jointly with King Philip of Spain. So, and that is recognized at the beginning of this document. So these words say, "In the name of God, Amen. In the 29th day of August, in the year of our Lord God, 1556, and in the 3rd and 4th years of the reigns of our sovereign Lord and Lady." I've never ever seen this in a document before, but it's interesting. I will read it all. "Our sovereign Lord and Lady Philip and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, Spain, France, both Sicilies, Jerusalem and Ireland, defenders of the faith, Archduke of Austria, Dukes of Burgundy, Milan and Brabant, Count of Habsburg, Flanders and Tyrol. I, John Goddard, will so-and-so. So the King and Queen had to be graced with that enormous style. And it's very rare to find documents that include that complete style. Anyway, this is the will of John Goddard in 1556. In it, he passes to his widow Elizabeth his land at Upham and Snap, and to his son Thomas the lordship of Upham and Snap. Now, it's not clear if that's actually lord of the manor or just lord of the estate. To his widow Elizabeth and son Thomas the younger, my mansion house in Aldbourne. And again, it's not clear, is that Upham House, or is that some other house down here actually in the village proper? I suspect it's actually Upham House, but I can't say that that's absolutely certain. To my son Thomas the elder, lease of the close and farm lease of Stock Close and farm at Aldbourne. So there's Stock Close and the farm, split in half by what remained of the chase. To Elizabeth and both Thomases, the lease of East Lees. So out there in the far northwest, that whole estate at East Lees has already been enclosed, and it all had belonged in 1556. It was part of the Goddard's lands. There's no clue yet as to how much further back we must go to find out how long it had really been in the hands of the Goddards. We certainly know it was in their hands and it was already enclosed by 1556. So what is all this land? Well, a thought suddenly struck me. If we go back to the Domesday, we see that it tells us that in the Lord's domain are 18 hides of land. We'll worry in a minute about what a hide is. And that he also uses on it 10 ploughs. But if we go back a little further in this little document, this entry, we'll see that right at the beginning, it tells us that the manor as a whole contained 40 hides. Now, if the manor contained 40 hides and the Lord had as his own personal, for his own personal use, 18 hides, that's very nearly 50%. That's very nearly half of the whole 15 square miles of the manor and parish of Aldbourne. And if we think then about that map that we saw before, if you look at the orange area of the Warren and the red area of Upham and Snap, and the blue area of Stock Close, and the shaded green area of the Chase, you're looking at about 50% of the land area of the parish. And I believe that what we saw in 1809 in the enclosure, the land that's already been enclosed, the great majority of that was actually the Lord's personal land back at Domesday. So that would have been enclosed already from Domesday. Right, that's the first little revelation, I hope. I hope it's not been too boring. Lords of the manor. I'm going to move on now. We've done lords, we've done lands, now it's lords. And then at the end, it'll be litigation. The lords of the manor. We know prior to 1625, it was the Duchy of Lancaster. They handed it to the City of London. In 1631, they sold the manor of Aldbourne to a Thomas Bond. So who was Thomas Bond? Later on, he became Sir Thomas. Well, he was born in 1580. He was the son of Sir George Bond, who was Lord Mayor of London. So we're already seeing that this is somebody who's something in society. He's sufficiently well off that at the age of less than 20, he went off on the Grand Tour, which is a very unusual thing to do already in 1590. The Grand Tours were really the things that started at the end of the 1600s through the 1700s. So he's been very early on his gap year. When he came back from his gap year, he took a post as secretary to Sir John Egerton, where his immediate predecessor, had been the poet John Donne, which is interesting because we'll hear about John Donne later on again. Egerton died in 1617, so he thought he'd have a second tour. And off he went. He's still rolling in money because when he came back, he purchased the office of one of the 6 clerks in Chancery. or this is in 1611 he did this, sorry, before he even went. Um, um, Clerk in Chancery was one of those government sinecures where you could farm off all the real work to minions and just cream off the money to oneself. It was a very, very lucrative post. You can see how lucrative because 6 years later, 7 years later, he sold it for £6,000 because somebody else thought they could make even more money out of it. With that 6,000 company, he invested in the Virginia Company, so became involved in tobacco plantations and slavery. And he also thought, well, Chancery didn't really earn me enough money, so he purchased the receivership of fines at the Alienation Office, which is another of these offices whereby well-connected young men could cream off enormous amounts of money. They didn't have to be quite as clever and manipulative as they do nowadays, although nowadays people are just as successful at creaming it off. The fines at the Alienation Office. Now, what could that be? The Alienation Office was set up by Henry VIII in 1538 to handle the money that came in from every time that a property changed that he had confiscated from the Catholic Church. Every time that a property changed hands, fine was payable. They use the term fine not in the sense that we use it as a punishment, but it was simply what you paid to receive some benefit. So he was the receiver of the fines, and he would pass it all on off to the royal coffers, but quite an amount of it would end up stuck to his hands as it went. He was MP for Launceston in Cornwall, and he was then MP for Southampton. And he was a hero. He was a hero of a traffic accident. Would you believe it? An RTA in the Strand in 1624. And we know about it because there was a man who's made it his business to record every action that went on in the court of King James. And he published it in a 1,000-page book. And here we are. Here is an entry. On Sunday, the 29th of February, says Archbishop Laud in his diary, in the evening, the Duke of Buckingham's coach was overthrown between Exeter House and the Savoy, actually right outside Durham House, which is where Thomas Bond lived. The Spanish ambassador lay there. No omen, I hope, more than they thought to soil him. I think he was rather being nasty about the Spanish ambassador. Secretary Conway was in the coach with him. Mr. Bond came into the help, he told it to me. So Mr. Bond became quite a hero around the court, thought of as being a very brave man. And his sign went up ever after. So the next year, he became even more lucrative, the receiver for the Duchy of Lancaster in the south. Now he really is getting to the top of these royal offices, whereby you can have lots of lovely lucre stick to your hands. So that's what he is from sometime after 1625. And that's what he became. Having become responsible for the Duchy of Lancaster in the south, he thought he'd better have a country estate in the south. And he leased Aldbourne St. George Manor House and the grounds from King's College, who were the lords of the manor of Aldbourne St. George. And in 1632, he purchased the lease of the manor of Aldbourne, and he paid £1,906 for it, and had to pay the king £77. Had to pay the City of London £77, 3 shillings and 4 pence halfpenny. Now that indicates to me that with the manor of Aldbourne came the rump of Aldbourne, not including those enclosed areas, because I know that the full rent for the complete manor of Aldbourne was £135 a year and a halfpenny. And he's only being required to pay £77 of that. So the rest of that 135 is being paid by whoever at the time owns the various other pieces of land that we saw earlier on had been enclosed. He married a lady called Frances Bale when he was 56 and she was 22. And she was described as a very handsome young woman. And I dare say tongues wagged massively as a result. She didn't provide him with any sons. Or did they? Did she? My mind's gone blank. Whether the next lord is a son or a nephew. Anyway, he was made, the royalists made him magistrate for Wiltshire in the early 1640s. And later on in the 1640s, the parliamentarians made him sheriff of Wiltshire. So he was obviously very good at sitting on the fence or turning his coat. Anyway, there we have Sir Thomas Bond, an interesting gent. And here we have, oh, sorry, I'm getting lost here. So there we have Sir Thomas Bond, and he was followed by George Bond, who I can see was his son. So the fine lady did provide him with 2 children.
Can I ask you a question there?
Yes.
Elizabeth Bottom.
Hold your horses. Hold your horses. Haven't got to her yet. 1653, George Bond now. You might notice Elizabeth on that chart. Here is George Bond. He inherited in 1653. And in 1660, a momentous event, Charles II was returned to the throne. And one of the first things that Charles II decided to do to reward all the people who he felt had helped him is to create a new order of chivalry called the Knights of the Royal Oak. And blow me, George Bond was nominated to be one of the Knights of the Royal Oak. Fortunately, perhaps, wiser brains intervened and persuaded Charles II that creating a new order of chivalry for all the people who'd helped him during the interregnum would rather be rubbing the other side's nose in it, and was not perhaps the right sort of thing that a unifying king should do. So the Knights of the Royal Oak never actually came into existence. Soon after that, we come to our first piece of litigation. George Bond gets into it. And the problem is the Duchy of Lancaster and the Earl of Pembroke, who we'll see is the owner of the Warren, took George Bond to court as Lord of the Manor in 1668. Unfortunately, we only have a single document or 2 linked documents to do with this, which is the list of questions that they asked the witnesses and the answers of one of the witnesses, We have no paper that tells us what this court case was about, nor anything that tells us what the final judgment was. But we can run quickly through the questions and the answers, and we'll see that it sort of fits in with what becomes a theme through this talk. So the witnesses are to be asked, do you know the parties, the Duchy of Lancaster and the Earl of Pembroke and George Bond, and the Chase and the Warren? Were the Earls of Pembroke owners of the Chase and Warren? Was the Rangership sold by Mr. Walrond in 1622? Do you know a place called Deer Lodge, which has now been destroyed? And do you know Snap Park and Hillwood? And did you know that the Bond family held the Chase under lease, or if they held the Chase under lease? And whether they held the Rangership under the Earl of Pembroke? And who did they take the profits as the right of office of the Rangership? What coppices or certain coppices, were they part of the manor or not? And did the Bond family take the wood from those coppices? Were they entitled to? Anything else you know? So, witness William Smith, aged 48. I think that's wonderful. All of these, whenever they had a witness, they always took their age. And that's what's come down to us now in the newspapers. You need to read a newspaper report, and they always quote the age of the people that they're talking about. And that's a fallback from 500 years ago in these legal documents. Anyway, do you know the parties in the Chase and Warren? Yes. Were they owners of the Chase? Well, he'd heard that the Bond family rented the Warren. Didn't say anything about the Chase. The Walrons had held the Rangership, and yes, they sold it to the Earl of Pembroke, but he couldn't say when. And he did know Deer Lodge, where the Ranger used to live, and that it had now been pulled down. And he knew of Snap Park and Hillwood. He heard that the Bonds had leased the Chase, but he didn't know what terms they'd leased it for. And he had heard that they now held the Rangership of the Chase. He knew that the Bond family took the profits, but not by what right they took them. And he'd heard that some coppices had been excluded from the manor. So what he has to say is all hearsay. None of it seems to be what he knows himself. Number 10, did the Bonds take wood from the coppices? He didn't know. Is there anything else he can say? No. So that is a record of one dispute in 1668. We can see that the dispute is over the confusion between what is the Warren and what is the Chase, and whether the Chase is still held separate from the manor. Just general confusion over what bit of the manor really is part of the manor, and is it something separate because the king 50 years ago kept it to himself. Just general confusion over that. Oh my goodness me, I'm going to have to hurry up. We're not going to get through this. 1668, as we've seen, George Bond was sued about the Rangership. And in 1684, he wrote his will, leaving the manor to his widow, Elizabeth Bond, that you were asking about, as her jointure, which is the right of the widow to use the use of the house and everything that goes with it during her lifetime. but she cannot then will it or leave it to anyone else. It's already by the original will been entailed to somebody. So it was to be her jointure. 6 months later, George has a change of heart. And so he's fed up with the manor and he sells it to Richard Kent of Corsham. But he does agree with Richard Kent that he will pay £100 per year annuity to Elizabeth in lieu of her jointure. And then 6 months after that, no, 18 months after that, George Bond dies. So he is no longer Lord of the Manor when he dies. And our new Lords of the Manor become Richard Kent, or becomes Richard Kent, soon to be followed by his nephew, John Kent. Now, what do we know about them? Richard Kent purchased the manor, and we know that he paid the Bond family 8,500 for it, which is rather more than the 1,900 that they'd paid 50 years earlier. But they only bought it for that price using mortgages of £2,000 and £3,000, so a total of £5,000 of mortgage on the property. And I strongly suspect that at least one of those mortgages was with the Bond family themselves. Anyway, 8 years later, Richard Kent dies and leaves the manor to his nephew, John. John Kent failed to keep up any of the payments, either on the mortgages or on the annuities. And so in 2 years later, after 2 years of not paying his payments, June 1692, he's sued by Elizabeth Bond for the outstanding debts. And then there is another court case which goes on for 2 years and ends up with the court foreclosing on the mortgages and ordering that the manor be conveyed back to Elizabeth Bond. So from June 1694, Elizabeth Bond becomes the lady of the manor.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Where was the manor? I'll tell you why I ask that, because in the late 1690s, Elizabeth Bond rented out courthouse to the courts.
Yeah. Okay.
So we know she owned the courthouse at that time.
Okay. Can I just repeat that for our people on Zoom? I've just been asked about Elizabeth Bond and whether she had as her manor house the courthouse, because what we know is in the 1690s, she rented it to the Core family. If she that actually ties it down that the courthouse must have effectively been the manor house, although because she would not have been living here in the village, she would have lived in their property in Aldbourne St George, the manor house at Aldbourne St George. She rented out the Aldbourne manor house to the Core family. So there we are. There's another mystery solved. Yes, the courthouse was the manor house, although the Lord of the Manor himself or herself never actually lived there. So, yes, okay. Excellent. Anyway, Elizabeth Bond, there is the Bond family. There's Thomas and George and Elizabeth, who he married. And as you can see, Elizabeth had 2 children, although if you can see there, her son George died before she did. So she remained lady of the manor until she died. So we're back to Elizabeth Bond as lady of the manor. She was awarded ownership in June 1694. And she certainly negotiated the sale of parts of the manor and East Lees, and even it's thought the manor itself. She tried to negotiate the sale of those to various people, including Oliver Core. But she wasn't able to. She wasn't able to because John Kent held all the documents, all of the deeds, and he refused to release them. He's the chap, if you remember, who hadn't paid the money for his paid for his mortgage interest nor his annuity, and had been forced to relinquish the manor. And so, as his revenge, he held on to the documents. And so it was a great struggle for Elizabeth to actually manage to make any of the sales that she needed to. She lived on till 1728, beyond her only son. And so she left the manor to her daughter, Frances, who by now was Frances Hulbert. Now, she's an interesting lady, but she's the start of next year's. And there we are. So there are our lords of the manor through the 17th century, from the City of London through the Bonds, the Kents, back to the Bonds. And that's where it was through until the 1720s. Now we're going to look at another family. We're going to look at the people who rented the Warren. And you look through the documents and you see this was leased to the Earl of Pembroke, and that was confirmed to the Earl of Pembroke, and the Earl of Pembroke rented this, and the Earl of Pembroke leased that, and the Earl of Pembroke took somebody to court.
So very happy either tonight.
What didn't occur to me until I really started going through all of those notes and in devises
Thank you,
is
Michael.
that for this period, there are 6 Earls of Pembroke.
Lorraine will
and most of them were quite interesting. In fact, the Earls of Pembroke are so interesting, I'm going to start 2 generations earlier to give you an idea of where they came from. So here are the first 3 Earls of Pembroke. We have William and his son Herbert and his grandson William. Now, if we look at William, the first Earl of Pembroke, according to John Aubrey, brilliant book, Brief Lives. According to John Aubrey, he was known as a mad fighting young fellow. In fact, he was so mad and so keen on fighting that he killed a sheriff in Bristol, and he was arrested, but he escaped and fled to France, where he joined the army of King Francis and fought for King Francis of France in battles against the Spanish and against the United Provinces, what's now the Netherlands, in all of the wars that Francis fought. And he acquitted himself very well, so well indeed, that Francis recommended him to King Henry VIII as being a good sort of chap that he ought to have around him. And so he was allowed back into England, where Henry granted him some of the estates which he just confiscated off the Catholic Church. And the great estate that he got was Wilton Abbey. To this day, Wilton House down near Salisbury is the home of the Herberts, the Earls of Pembroke.
yes.
He did himself well in marriage. He married Anne, the sister of Queen Charlotte Parr, Queen Catherine Parr. So he was the brother-in-law of King Henry, through Henry's 6th wife, Catherine Parr. And he became the guardian of King Edward VI, the young king who ascended to the throne aged 9. And so for until 7 years, until Edward became 16, William was effectively ruling the country or at least one of two people who were ruling the country together. After Edward's death, his sister or half-sister Mary Tudor came to the throne, a Catholic, so much a Catholic that she married Philip, the King of Spain. And so Catholicism was the thing now. And here was William living in this wonderful abbey, which had been confiscated from the nuns a few years before. And so he thought he'd better let them back in. And so he allowed the nuns to return to their abbey. And he met them on his knees at the gatehouse of Wilton Abbey, saying, "Peccavi, peccavi, I have sinned, I have sinned." Back to Latin again. A few years later, within 10 or 12 years, Mary, of course, died. And so Elizabeth came to the throne, a Protestant. And well, he didn't want those nuns around anymore. And so they were thrown out of Wilton a second time. So another of these easily coat-turning people. Anyway, he passed away in 1570, and he passed his title on to his son. Oh, here we are. Oh, I forgot about his dog. Down in the bottom corner, you can see a little dog, and the story goes that the little dog pined away to death beside the coffin of his master. Right, his son was Henry Herbert, second Earl of Pembroke.
This is
And he married an interesting young lady,
Florence Nightingale's
rather a
Herbert.
dangerous young lady. He married Lady Catherine Grey, the sister of Queen Jane Grey. And there she is. She was very young. He was very young. You can see he's only 15, and I think she was even younger. Their marriage was never consummated, and so it was eventually dissolved. And he was lucky, therefore, not to suffer the fate of many of the relations and supporters of Lady Jane Grey when she went to the block. Many of her supporters also went, but Henry managed to avoid that. In 1554, he was made Gentleman of the Chamber to King Philip. He's become a real Catholic again now. And he took part in the siege of St. Quentin. So he's now fighting for Philip of Spain against the King of France, on the opposite side from what his father did, probably 30 years before. He married Lady Catherine Talbot, who she died before giving any children, and he then married Mary Sidney, by whom he had 4 children. And in 1580, he had a suit of armor made at Greenwich. And if you'd like to see this magnificent suit of armor, you need to go to New York, because it's on permanent display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He became Lord President of Wales. He was also interested in the theatre, possibly through his wife. And he was patron of Pembroke's Men, which were one of the troupes of theatre companies that there were around London and around the provinces. So the chances are, we know that he knew Ben Jonson. The chances are he also knew William Shakespeare personally. He died in 1601. But I'm going to talk briefly about his wife, about his third wife, Mary. Mary, Countess of Pembroke. She was born in 1561. She was a poet, an author, and a literary patron, and she was described as the cleverest and the most cultured lady in all of England. in the time of Queen Elizabeth. Oh, sorry, there we are. I'm getting ahead of myself. She was the sister and collaborator of Sir Philip Sidney, the well-known poet. And she was also a close member of Queen Elizabeth's entourage and said to have been one of Queen Elizabeth's favourites. She maintained a chemistry laboratory at Wilton House and employed a man to manage it for her. And the man she employed, Adrian Gilbert, was the half-brother of Sir Walter Raleigh. All these connections, it's just, it's what's it called, the five degrees of the separation. Everybody knew everybody in those days. She created a literary circle around her, one of the most important literary circles of the time around herself at Wilton, that included John Dymond, Edmund Spenser, Ben Jonson. Those we know, we have documents proving that they were members. The likelihood is that Shakespeare would also have been one, and Marlowe. If she's dealing with these people, she's probably dealing with all of the important literary figures of the time. And as part of her work as a poet, her brother, Sir Philip Sidney, died when he was translating Psalm number 50 into lyric English. And she completed the 150 Psalms. So the lyric Psalms are of Mary and Philip Sidney. So she was a very important person in the literary development of the country. And she died in 27th of October, 1621. And she was the mother of the first Earl of Pembroke, who's really involved with Aldbourne, because her son, William Herbert, who succeeded in 1601. In 1622, he leased Aldbourne Warren from King James I. And in 1622, he also bought the rangership from the Walrond family. And here we are, here are the Pembrokes now beginning to own the Warren. He's the man who founded Pembroke College. Shakespeare's first folio is actually dedicated to him and his brother Philip. They were a pair of brothers quite well known in literary circles and much looked up to. Indeed, William is thought to have been the fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets. So he clearly knew Shakespeare very, very closely. It's quite a surprise to see such an important gentleman spoken of in the way that Shakespeare did. He married Mary Talbot, but both his sons died young, so he had no heirs. But he did have lots of affairs with several mistresses, one of whom got so annoyed with him that she had him thrown in the Fleet for a few weeks. He was always getting into trouble with his mistresses. And he, in fact, had quite a number of illegitimate children, but no legitimate heirs. It's no wonder that the ladies flocked to him, because according again to John Aubrey, he had an annual income of £30,000 a year. Now, if you think 200 years later, Elizabeth Bennet was swooning over Mr. Darcy's £10,000 a year, you get some idea what 30,000 a year must have been. And he died on the 10th of April, 1630, as I say, with no heirs. So what do we do when there are no descendants? The title goes to his younger brother, the other brother that Shakespeare's folio was dedicated to. So here we have Philip Herbert, 4th Earl of Pembroke, and he continued to hold the lease of our Warren. In fact, in 1631, soon after he became the Earl, the lease and reversion had to be confirmed now by the City of London, because the ownership of the manor, of course, had passed to them, and the original lease had been from James as Lord of the Manor. So in 1631, he's the recipient of the lease and reversion. The reversion, if you don't know, at the end of a lease, so the lease, I think, was originally for 99 years. At the end of 99 years, if you also purchase the reversion, the end of 99 years, it becomes your property. Otherwise, it goes back to the landlord as his property. But the Earls of Pembroke purchased the reversion of the lease. He was made Earl of Montgomery in 1605. Don't know why. Just somebody thought it was a good idea. And he was a great lover of art. He was a patron of Anthony van Dyck. And this is a painting by Van Dyck of him. He was a patron of literature. As we know, he was clearly friends with Shakespeare. But over 40 books were dedicated to him. So he was very well thought of. In 1626, he held the spurs at Charles's coronation and succeeded his brother as Lord Chamberlain to the king. However, he also took after his grandfather because he was notorious for his unprovoked and violent assaults on people. But it didn't prevent him from getting well ahead in the society and in the court of the time. He was rich enough. He was one of the incorporators of the Guiana Company in 1626. In 1628, he received, and I assume this is from the king, he received a grant of the islands of Trinidad, Tobago, and Barbados as his own personal domain. And everything that suggests, the plantations and the people who worked them. But he continued at court and around wherever he went, violently assaulting people, all the while being extremely friendly with the king, although the king was becoming tired of his behavior. And the king wanted to get rid of him. And he finally had a pretext when Pembroke had another violent altercation. This time he struck Henry Howard Lord Travers with a cane during a committee meeting of the House of Lords. And that was definitely thought to be beyond the pale. So Charles demanded his resignation as Lord Chamberlain and replaced him with Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who from other talks you might remember came through Aldbourne in 1643 with his army and was harried by Prince Rupert in the Battle of Aldbourne Chase. So again, we have these connections that keep coming back. Oh, here we are. Sorry, I've been reading my notes and getting ahead of what you've been seeing. Yes, he's Lord Chamberlain to Charles, and he broke with the king after he had his violent quarrel in the committee. He took the parliamentary side in the Civil War, despite being still moderately good friends with the king. But he did keep at least a toe in the on the Cavalier side during the Civil War, and he really wavered between the two, although it was definitely a 90-10 split, I think, that he was with the parliamentarians, but still had a feelings for the other side. He was made by Parliament, he was made Chancellor of Oxford after they'd got rid of Archbishop Laud. And he was then appointed Constable of the Tower in 1649, thus becoming King Charles's jailer. He was also listed to be a judge at the trial of the king, but he refused to serve. So he ended up not being one of the regicides who sentenced Charles. He managed to avoid that. And he died in 1649 in this funny half year. We would call it 1650. They called it 1649. He had a son, also called Philip. So he now became the owner of the Warren, or maybe he thought by this time parts of the Chase, perhaps. Who knows? If we look at that document, it says Chase. Anyway, he was born in 1621 and succeeded in 1649. And he was a very handsome looking chap, very, very pleased with himself. But he doesn't seem to have done very much. At least the other two did some good things. He was MP for Wiltshire in 1640, and MP for Glamorgan, again in 1640. I don't know how he can sit in two places at once, until 1649, when, of course, he became a Lord and moved up to the House of Lords. He was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Somerset for a while, and he died. We don't know anything about him, but we do have a nice picture of him. He married twice, and so he did have a son. He had a son called William. So once when Philip died, the earldom, and therefore also the Aldbourne Warren, passed to his son, William, the 6th Earl of Pembroke. And he was born in 1641. But he was so important that, as far as we can tell, this is the only image that exists of him. Obviously pictured when he just got out of the bath, aged about 5. Anyway, there he is. There is William Herbert, the 6th Earl of Pembroke. He also was MP for Glamorgan from 1661 to 69. And that appears to be all that he did, and then died in 1674, still as the owner of the Warren of Aldbourne. Now we come to his half-brother. And his half-brother was Philip, the 7th Earl of Pembroke. And here he is. He was born in 1652, succeeded when he was 22 years old. And there he is, very reminiscent of his father. I've not been able to get quite such a high resolution image of him, so it's a bit blurry. He was prone to unprovoked violent assaults in spades. He has been referred to, and I don't know, sharp-eyed people might have noticed that I put his occupation on the family chart that you just saw. I put his occupation as what he was several times described as homicidal maniac. He married Henrietta de Keroualle he certainly picked them high because she was the sister of one of King Charles II's mistresses. And just to keep the strangeness on, his daughter Charlotte later on went on to marry the son of Judge Jeffreys, the hanging judge, who sentenced a number of my relatives to death during the Monmouth Rebellion. Yes, she married the son of Judge Jeffreys. And in 1675, he was Lord Lieutenant of Wiltshire. And now we come to another of our strange, fairly important pieces of litigation. And I've already run 15 minutes over. And this was a dispute over the ranger and the keepership of the chase. And it all comes down to the fact that in wordings of leases and other documents through the 1620s and 1650s, they'd used words like free warren, the warren of conies, the chase, the warren of conies or chase, quite freely, and never defined what any of them were. And so we were left, they had been left in a situation where nobody knew quite what the documents that they had in their possession actually entitled them to. Now, Thomas Halls is one of the defendants in this, and his family had been tenants of the Earl of Pembroke in the Warren, as had another of the defendants, Stephen Lydiard and William Sadler. They'd also been somebody called Tregonwell and Lawton. They'd been left part of the Warren in Earl William's will. And they were all squabbling about who owned what, and what the rangership entitled them to, and who actually held it. And the final judgment came down that said, it came down in the Earl of Pembroke's favour. Basically, he had documents proving his right that went back further and more clearly than any of the others. All persons claiming rights to any part of the free warren are to assign their right to the Earl of Pembroke forthwith. So the Earl of Pembroke settled all of those disputes by having a judge say it's all mine. I don't know whether he'd threatened the judge, but it would have been in character. So there we are. There is, he sued the Earl of Middlesex over it. Then in 1677, he nearly killed a man, Mr. Bourne, in a duel. 1678, he knocked over some chap in a tavern and kicked him to death. And he was indicted for that by a grand jury, and he was found guilty of manslaughter. He was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of manslaughter. And he was convicted, and therefore would be hanged as a peer with a silken rope. However, at that period, peers of the realm held a virtual get out of jail free card that said a peer of the realm will be pardoned of any of the first offence of any offence. And so he walked scot-free. He didn't forget what got him that far. And he was warned by the judge at his trial, having claimed privilege of peerage. He was warned by the judge that that operated only once, and that he would never be able to claim that again. He didn't take the warning to heart. in oh, I've actually missed out a little bit. And another incident in his life in 1678, Charles II, who's not somebody that was easily shocked, committed him to the Tower of London, quote, for uttering such horrid and blasphemous words and other actions proved upon oath as are not fit to be repeated in any Christian assembly, unquote. He was released 2 days later. On the 5th of February that year, a man called Philip Reichelt complained to the House of Lords that Pembroke had assaulted him in the Strand. And the House of Lords ordered him to give a recognizance of £2,000 to keep the peace. But already before the 5th of February, he'd killed a man called, I am going back. I'm going back to the man in the tavern. Sorry. Yes, and that all happened at the time that he kicked the man to death in the tavern. Oh, sorry. I'm confused by my notes. He assaulted Charles Sackville, the Earl of Dorset. And then on 17th of October, 1678, Sir Edmund Godfrey, who had been the foreman of the grand jury that had indicted Philip Herbert for the murder of Nathaniel Coney, he was found in a ditch on Primrose Hill with having been run through by his own sword. Now, Sir Edmund Godfrey also had other connections, and those other connections meant that the case of him being found murdered raised an uproar of anti-Catholicism. And the Protestant, the Church of England, and everybody rose up and the Catholics were assaulted. And this whole episode became known as the Popish Plot. If you've ever heard of the Popish Plot, it's all started by our friend and Warren owner, Philip Herbert. What a chap. And it was never proved, but the circumstances point very much to him being responsible for the murder of Sir Edmund. Then in 1680, he goes on to kill William Smith at Turnham Green. And he fled abroad, was tried in his absence, but won a royal pardon. It's amazing what you can do if you know the right people. And he sold the Chase or Warren. Again, they couldn't decide what it was. The Chase or Warren to Sir William Jones. I don't know if Eric is online, but I wonder whether Sir William is one of your Joneses, Eric. But the Warren was passed to Sir William Jones. Just as a final footnote on Philip, John Aubrey tells us that at Wilton he kept 52 mastiffs, 30 greyhounds, some bears and a lion. So he obviously liked to be surrounded by violent things.
You can talk now because you're unmuted, if you want.
Earls of Pembroke. He was succeeded by his brother, who was a very quiet chap, a very interesting chap. And I'm going to go very quickly past this. He, for some time, was president of the Royal Society, which gives you an idea that he was a completely different character from his brother. That's the end of the Herberts, the Earls of Pembroke. Thank God. We're now going to look at one of the other pieces of legislation. As I said, 1682, he sold the Warren to William Jones. And also we've seen before that in 1682, Richard Kent purchased the manor from the Bond family. So now we've got new people involved. And here we are, 1689, we have a new piece of a lawsuit brought by Richard Kent as Lord of the Manor and the tenants of Aldbourne against Richard Jones. And the problem was that the Jones family claimed an area of the chase called Dudmore Walk as part of their free warren. Now, I'm going to read the people who brought the action. They were Richard Kent of Corsham, Esquire, Lord of the Manor of Aldbourne, John Southby, Esquire, Francis Goddard, Esquire, John Crisp and Mary, his wife, Abigail King, widow, Gabriel Martin, gentleman, Elizabeth Martin, widow, John Smith, gentleman, Henry Evans, gentleman, Thomas Greenfield, apothecary, George Adams, the elder, Thomas Coleman, the elder, Oliver Core, Robert Pierce, Richard Scory, John Bacon, John Pierce, Zachary Dixon the elder, Zachary Dixon the younger, John Collins, Edward Witt, William King, John Elderfield, Henry Restall, William Mott, Thomas Wilde, John Core, Roger Brown, Thomas Collins, Thomas Strong, Henry Neat, William Neat, Nicholas Goddard, John Gilbert, Thomas Gilmore, Anthony Savory, Robert Church, John Looker, Mark Stoneham, Thomas Fowler, John Adey, Roger Adey, Thomas Mott, Richard Scory, John Bacon, Thomas Naxton, Charles Smith, Roger Dennis, Giles Stevens, Richard Shepherd, John Mudge, Thomas Bryn, Roger Lawrence, Timothy Fairchild, Susanna Gilbert, blah, 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 blah. All freeholders, copyholders, and leaseholders within the manor of Aldbourne. Gilbert, Bishop of Sarum and patron of the vicarage. William Jackson, Clerk, Vicar of Aldbourne. Richard Maggot, D.D., Dean of Winchester. Owners of the parsonage within the manor of Aldbourne. Francis Nicholas, widow, and Oliver Nicholas, her son, tenants of the parsonage. There's a complete list of all of the householders, all of the tenants of the manor. Basically a census of the manor in 1689. Doesn't exist anywhere else. And what a surprise it was to find that in these documents. Right, to carry on. I think we're nearly through. The problem was that the Joneses had built boroughs on the common land in the chase and established rabbits there, basically expanding the warren. And it's long been known a problem for pasturing cattle because the rabbits ate everything. And there had been a series of complaints, not always reaching up to a lawsuit for the previous 50 years about rabbits getting into the chase and getting onto the common land, and actually way back into the 1500s. And it had been the subject of lawsuits over the previous 20 years. And this lawsuit was to give power. The people of Aldbourne and the Joneses had finally come to an agreement. And this completed and gave power to the agreement. And this is an important agreement because it changed parts of the life in Aldbourne forever. The conies are to be destroyed and the right of free warren extinguished. It's the end of the warren. Part of the disputed land, and it does a perambulation to say precisely what part, is to be enclosed, the rest to remain common. The office of rangership or keepership of the chase and all its rights and privileges to be extinguished. So there, effectively, we have the end of the warren, we have the end of the keepership of the chase, we have the end of the chase being used in any form as a deer park. So I've shown that the Lord's domain land was converted into private estates in the Tudor period and perhaps even earlier. I've shown you who the men and a couple of women were who were lords of the manor, ladies of the manor, following its transfer from the City of London. Talked about the extraordinary family who held the Warren and perhaps parts of the Chase through the century. And we've talked about some of the disputes and litigation that went on between them. And I'm sorry I've run on for so long, but that's the end.